Hello, everyone. So welcome to the Electrochemical Colloquium. Today, we will be discussing the electrochemical reactions that involve proton-coupled electron transfer. And such reactions, as many of you know, are very important because they happen in so many processes. For example, during electrocatalysis, hydrogen UPD, various bioelectrochemical reactions, and autosphere molecular transformations. However, theoretical description and modeling of such proton-coupled electron transfer is, especially at the electrochemical interfaces, is very challenging. But as you know, at this colloquium, we love challenging topics. And so our today's speaker is Professor Sharon Hammes-Schiffer, who's one of the best experts in the theoretical description of chemical reactions and in computational chemistry, and who puts a significant emphasis on the theory of proton-coupled electron transfer in her research. So Sharon received her PhD from Stanford University in 1993. And after being a postdoc at the Bell's lab in 1995, she became a professor at the University of Notre Dame. In 2000, she moved to Penn State University and was a professor there until 2012. And then Sharon moved to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And since 2018, she's been a professor of chemistry at Yale University. So Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to host you here. So now the stage is yours.
Okay, so I assume you can hear me okay and see my slides? We're good?
Yes, all is
okay,
great.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for inviting me to talk to this crowd about theoretical modeling of electrochemical proton-coupled electron transfer. So as you said, and I think probably everyone here knows, proton-coupled electron transfer, or PCET, is important throughout biology in photosynthesis, respiration, many different enzyme reactions. It's also important in chemical processes relevant to fuel cells, solar cells, and other energy devices. And you can see examples here of photosynthesis in a dye-sensitized photoelectrochemical cell where electrons and protons are transferring in different places in different directions. And for this particular colloquium, PCET is important in many electrocatalytic processes, such as carbon dioxide, nitrogen and oxygen reduction, water splitting, and the list would go on and on. So what I'm going to do in this talk, this is a roadmap, is start out talking about fundamental concepts of PCET theory. And then I'll talk about homogeneous electrochemical PCET theory, giving some rate constant expressions, how you calculate the input quantities, and a couple of applications. And then I'll talk about heterogeneous electrochemical PCET theory. So we're starting with the fundamental concepts of PCET theory. But before we get to that, I want to just define what I mean by PCET. So we have at least one electron and one proton transferring simultaneously. The electron and the proton could transfer between different donors and acceptors, as shown in this picture here, or between the same donors and acceptors, often called hydrogen atom transfer. The electron and the proton could transfer in the same direction as shown here, or in different directions. It could be completely opposite or orthogonal. The mechanism could be sequential with a thermodynamically stable intermediate, or conservative with no stable intermediate. And the reaction could involve only one electron and one proton, as shown here, or it could involve multiple electrons and multiple protons. So I use a very broad definition of PCET, and all of this falls under the umbrella of PCET. Now, over the past 20 years or so, my group's been developing a general theory for PCET, where we include the quantum mechanical effects of the electrons and the transferring protons, and the coupling and the varying timescales among the electrons, the protons, the donor-acceptor modes, the solvent in the protein. And what I'll do in this talk, I will be following the systematic derivation of this theory, but I'll also be pointing out important contributions from other groups and placing it all in historical context. So before I go any further, I want to define what I mean by homogeneous and heterogeneous electrochemical PCET. So in homogeneous PCET, the electrode serves as a reservoir for electrons, but it does not participate in the chemical bond breaking and forming. So the electron then transfers from the complex to the electrode or back, and the proton will transfer within the molecule or within a hydrogen bonding complex. It could be transferring to a solvent, for example. In heterogeneous PCET, we have the electrode participating in the chemistry itself. It's participating in bond breaking and forming, as well as serving as a reservoir for electrons. So in this case, the proton is being transferred to or from the electrode surface or to a chemisorbed species. So these are the two different cases we're going to look at, but we're going to start out at the very beginning, which is with Marcus theory for electron transfer. Just one slide to define the terminology and then just to build up the theory of PCET from here. And many, of course, many people contributed to the electron transfer field. I only list a few names here, but the list would take more than a slide. So for single electron transfer, we can describe it in terms of two diabatic states. In the first state, the electron is localized on the donor. In the second state, the electron is localized on the acceptor. And then the free energies of these two states are just parabolas along a collective solvent coordinate. So we have a blue parabola for state 1 and a red parabola for state 2. The physical meaning of this collective solvent coordinate shown down here, you can see when the electron's on the donor, the solvent dipoles are oriented to stabilize the electron on that side. When the electron is on the acceptor, the solvent is reorganized, and now the dipoles are oriented to stabilize the electron on the acceptor. And it's this solvent reorganization from here to here that corresponds to moving along our collective solvent coordinate from the blue minimum to the red minimum. Now, when the coupling between these two states is very small, the reaction is non-adiabatic, and the rate constant is given down here. You can see it depends exponentially on the free energy barrier, which can be expressed in terms of delta G naught, that's the free energy of reaction, and lambda, the reorganization energy. And the rate constant is also proportional to the square of the electronic coupling. So this is Marcus theory in a nutshell, very fast. But the concepts have then been extended to proton transfer by Casey Hines and coworkers, and also by Arya Warshall. So in that case now, these two states correspond to the proton localized on the donor or the acceptor. We still have a collective solvent coordinate with the same physical meaning, but now these states are proton vibrational states instead of electronic states. So what we did is we said, let's take ideas from single electron and single proton transfer and build a theory for PCET. And now we need 4 states instead of only 2. And I will point out the 4-state model has been used by others, for example, Cuquier and Nocera. And of course, square diagrams are used throughout chemistry by many people in many contexts. But in this case, these are correspond to, these 1 and 2 correspond to the electron transfer states, and A and B correspond to the proton transfer states. So for example, in 1A, the electron and the proton are both on their donors. In 2B, they're both on their acceptors. And then we have a state 2A where only the electron is transferred, and we have a state 1B where only the proton is transferred. And this framework allows us to describe both sequential and concerted PCET. So sequential corresponds to going along the outside of this square. It could be ET-PT or PT-ET. And concerted corresponds to going along the diagonal. We call that EPT. And the mechanism is determined by the relative energies and couplings of these 4 states. When the off-diagonal states are much higher in energy, the reaction will be concerted. It will follow the diagonal to avoid those high energy states. And then this reduces to a 2-state model. Now you could just view it as 1A and 2B. Those are our 2 states and move on. But it's a little more subtle than that because the 2-state model is really, the reactant is really a mixture of 1A and 1B, mostly 1A, and the product is really a mixture of 2A and 2B, mostly 2B. So what does that mean exactly? So we're going to just call the reactant with the Roman numeral 1 and the product with the Roman numeral 2. And so for the reactant, it's this mixture of the 1A and 1B diabatic states. So those are shown with these dashed lines, their energies along the hydrogen coordinate. Now, if we mix them, because they have large coupling, what we're interested in is this solid curve at the bottom. This is the proton potential for the reactant state, Roman numeral 1. We can do the same thing with the product. We have these 2 states, 2A and 2B, the dashed lines. We mix them, because again, large coupling, and we just are interested in this lower potential energy curve. This lower curve corresponds to the electron-pronic ground state energy along the hydrogen coordinate. And to understand, because these are so important, I give an example here of what exactly this means. So we have a molecule, and the proton is transferring from this oxygen to this nitrogen. Now, we can equilibrate the proton for the electron on the donor for the reactant state, and it will be on the oxygen. We can also say, let's optimize the proton when the electron is on the acceptor for the product, and we're going to get the proton localized on the nitrogen. So then we can take these two positions and we can define the hydrogen coordinate. This axis here says the proton will move from this oxygen to this nitrogen along this hydrogen coordinate. This is the x-axis I'm showing here as hydrogen coordinate. So if you want to generate these potentials, the blue and the red, the lower potentials, what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, I'm going to put the electron on the donor here. Maybe the donor's down here somewhere. So the proton will want to be on the oxygen, but I'm going to then move the proton along this axis, keeping all of the other nuclei fixed. So I'm just doing single point energy calculations, moving the proton along, and I'm going to get this curve here along that hydrogen coordinate. Again, the axis is simply connecting where the proton starts to where it ends. All right, you can do the same thing for the product. You can say, okay, now I'm going to put the electron on the acceptor. So the acceptor might be up here somewhere. Now the proton wants to be on the nitrogen instead. So again, I'm going to march the proton along this axis, do single point energy calculations with all the other nuclei fixed, and then I'm going to get this red curve here. So these are the proton potentials that are so crucial to PCET theory, this blue one and this red one. So now we don't have to worry about 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B anymore. All we worry about is the reactant, which is given in blue for this talk, and the product, which is given in red for this talk. So we have these two proton potentials, the reactant and the product, right? And again, this is that same hydrogen coordinate I talked about before, where we're just moving the proton from where it starts to where it ends. Okay, now we want to treat the proton quantum mechanically. So what we do is we say for this reactant proton potential, we're going to solve the Schrodinger equation for the proton moving in this potential. And we're going to get a bunch of vibrational energy levels. And we're naming them mu equals 0, 1, 2, 3. So if you imagine a harmonic oscillator, you would just solve this equation and you get a bunch of wave functions. And these kind of look like that. But it's very important to realize that this is not harmonic. This proton potential has a shoulder here. In some cases, it even has a local minimum there. You're going to see some examples of that later. So it's very important that the proton potentials are not assumed to be harmonic, because that can actually miss a lot of the important physics of PCET. So we have this proton potential. We solve for the proton vibrational states in it. We get these mu equals 0, 1, 2, 3. We do the same thing now for the product. We have this red potential here. Again, solve for the proton moving in this potential. We get nu equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, and get all these vibrational states. Now, the vibronic states are products of an electronic state, so either the reactant or product electronic state, and one of these proton vibrational states. So we have a whole set of reactant vibronic states, which is the reactant electronic state times mu equals 0, and then another one which corresponds to mu equals 1, and another is mu equals 2, and so forth. For the product, we have the product electronic state times nu equals 0, nu equals 1, nu equals 2, and so forth, and we have a whole set of these product vibronic states. These vibronic states play a very important role in PCET theory. Now, we've derived, using multi-state continuum theory, we've derived analytical expressions for the free energy surfaces of these electron-proton vibronic states as a function of two collective solvent coordinates. One of them corresponds to proton transfer, and one of them corresponds to electron transfer. Now, this is completely analogous to the Marcus theory parabolas I showed earlier, where again, there was a collective solvent coordinate. I showed that picture of the solvent dipoles reoriented themselves when the electron transferred from the donor to the acceptor. These have the exact same physical meaning. This ET1 corresponds to the electron transferring and how the solvent reorganizes when the electron transfers. The PT1 corresponds to how the solvent reorganizes when the proton transfers. So they have the same physical meaning as the collective solvent coordinates for Marcus theory, but now we have two of them because we have two charges transferring, the electron and the proton. So we end up with two-dimensional paraboloids instead of one-dimensional parabolas. But because we like to think in one dimension, we're just going to take a slice of these, connecting the two minima of these paraboloids, and we get now two parabolas, a blue one and a red one. And you can see now it looks a lot like Marcus theory, right? We have two parabolas along a collective solvent coordinate, but it's important to realize now this collective solvent coordinate is really a diagonal in this two-dimensional solvent coordinate space. And it's important to realize these are not electronic states. These are actually electron-proton vibronic states. So here I show only the lowest paraboloids, the ground vibronic states for the reactant and the product, and that's what I'm showing here as well. And you can understand that these are actually vibronic states and not electronic states by looking at the proton potentials, which I show in these black dotted circles. So these are the same proton potentials I was talking about before when you just move the proton again along the axis from its starting point to its end point, and you just do single point energy calculations, you get this potential. That's what this potential is here for the reactant with the electrons on the donor. And then as we move, you can see when we go along this collective solvent coordinate, we change the relative energy of this state so that it actually goes up. The shape of the potential is assumed to be pretty much the same along the collective solvent coordinate. So we assume that it's the same, although it could change slightly. Now for the product, we have a proton potential, and you can see the asymmetry of the proton potential is flipped. Right now, the minimum is on the other side, just like we saw before, and the ground proton vibrational state will be localized on the other side. It's on the acceptor side, whereas for the reactant, it's on the donor side. And again, as we change the collective solvent coordinate, we're going to change the energy of this state as well. And in the middle here, they become degenerate. So at this crossing point, these two vibronic states, or the ground proton vibrational states of each of these potentials, they are degenerate. And so that's the general picture that comes out of this. And it's important to realize that these are indeed vibronic states. But here I'm showing only the lowest, the ground proton vibrational state. Remember, I showed mu equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And same thing here, nu equals 0, 1, 2, 3. What about all those excited states? Well, we actually have two sets of these paraboloids corresponding to all those different vibronic states. I'm only showing the lowest one here, but imagine two sets of stacked bowls, right? Those are the paraboloids that correspond to our different vibronic states in PCET. Now, if we then take slices along their minima, we're just going to get a set of stacked parabolas, blue set and a red set. And again, these electron-proton vibronic states correspond to the different proton vibrational states for each electronic state. And that's why we have these two sets of stacked parabolas. Another way to look at this, to be clear that the meaning of the different types of coordinates is that we have this collective solvent coordinate, right? These are the Marcus-like parabolas here. We have the blue ones and the red ones. These are parabolic because we assume the response of the solvent is harmonic. It's linear response of the solvent, similar to Marcus theory for electron transfer. But each one of these states corresponds to a different proton vibrational state in the proton potential. So on the left here, I show the proton potential for the reactant, right? When the electron's on the donor. And you can see that it looks a little asymmetric toward this direction. And we've got the ground proton vibrational state, the first excited state. Again, they look kind of like harmonic oscillators, but they're not harmonic here. These are anharmonic. And as I mentioned, they can have big shoulders or even minima over here. But regardless, you can see that each one of these energy levels corresponds to the free energy of the minimum of one of our parabolas. And so the splittings here correspond to the splittings between the proton vibrational energy levels. Same thing on the product side. Here are the splitting between the proton vibrational energy levels of the product proton potential corresponds to the splitting between these parabolas in the collective solvent coordinate space. So the collective solvent coordinates harmonic, the proton potentials are not harmonic, they're anharmonic. And again, very important to include that anharmonicity. Now the question is, how do we describe these reactions? We have all these vibronic states. Well, in one limit, if it's vibronically adiabatic, we can just say, well, PCET occurs on the ground vibronic state. So we're just going to move along the blue one, and then they're going to smoothly connect to this, interpolate from blue to red, because you're going to say there's strong coupling, and you're going to move along to the red. So when I say adiabatic, vibronically adiabatic means PCET occurs on the ground vibronic state. And that's a very clean definition. No excited states are involved. You can use transition state theory. So this is the standard way people often describe chemical reactions, right? At electrode surfaces, they just do a DFT calculation, get a transition state, get a reactant, get the barrier, plug it into transition state theory rate constant, and you got a rate constant. But in many cases, PCET reactions are actually vibronically non-adiabatic. And that means that they involve excited electronic and or vibrational states. So that's how I'm defining these, that basically adiabatic is if it occurs on the ground vibronic state, and non-adiabatic is everything else, right? Anytime an excited electronic or vibrational state gets involved. In this case, we need to describe the reaction in terms of non-adiabatic transitions between pairs of reactant and product vibronic states. So for example, every pair of these parabolas, every time they intersect, we need to describe a non-adiabatic transition. And it's easier to just look at one pair just to get sorted out here. So I'm just going to look at the ground state again. So we've seen this picture before. So we've got the blue parabola, the red parabola, we've got these proton potentials. Again, when the electron's on the donor, the proton donor well is lower in energy, and the proton vibrational ground state is localized on that side. For the product, when the electron's on the acceptor, the asymmetry is flipped. And that's just because of the electrostatic attraction between the electron and the proton. Whichever side the electron's on, it's going to pull the proton toward that side. So here it's pulling it toward the donor, and for the product, it's pulling it toward the acceptor. And as we move along this collective solvent coordinate, we change the relative energies of these vibronic states. So at this crossing point, they're degenerate. So the general mechanism is we start out at the minimum of the blue parabola. Then there's some sort of solvent fluctuation leading to this crossing point. Now the electron and the proton will tunnel from their donors to their acceptors with some probability. And then the solvent reorganization will lead to the relaxation back to the red minimum. And we can see this in movie form. So you start out, the electron and proton are on their donors. Reorganization of the environment leads to this crossing point. Now the electron and the proton are tunneling from their donors to their acceptors. And then further reorganization of the environment stabilizes the product state. So this is the general picture that comes out of the vibronically non-adiabatic case. So now I want to take a few minutes to talk about these different types of non-adiabaticity. So I've already mentioned vibronic non-adiabaticity. So in this case, we have electrons, we have a transferring proton, and then we have the environment, everything else. We're going to call N for all the other nuclei. Now, we're treating the electrons and the transferring proton quantum mechanically, so that's our quantum subsystem. And then everything else we're going to say is classical. So when I say vibronically non-adiabatic, I mean that the electrons and the protons do not respond instantaneously to the motion of the other nuclei. If they did respond instantaneously, it would be adiabatic. But they don't. They drag a little bit. Okay, they lag. The electron and the proton are not responding instantaneously, and therefore it's vibronically non-adiabatic between the quantum subsystem and the classical subsystem. And one metric is looking at the coupling between the vibronic states, this V mu nu, all right? And if that coupling, that vibronic coupling is much less than the thermal energy, that's related to the environment, right? Then the reaction is vibronically non-adiabatic, and the rate constant can be derived with Fermi's golden rule and is proportional to the square of the vibronic coupling. So this is related, the vibronic non-adiabaticity has to do with the electron-proton subsystem with respect to all of the other nuclei. Now, this is a simplified version. Other conditions need to be met to be non-adiabatic. I don't want to get too bogged down in this, so I'm just using a simplified version, but the experts will realize that there's a little more to it than this. But there's another kind of non-adiabaticity I want to talk about, which is electron-proton non-adiabaticity. That's between these two subsystems within the quantum subsystem. So if the electron responds instantaneously to the proton motion, then it's electronically adiabatic. But if it does not, if it drags a little again, then it's non-adiabatic. And so we have these two cases, and this determines the form of the vibronic coupling. So this V mu nu has a different form depending on which limit you're in. In the adiabatic limit, if the electron is responding instantaneously, we can just generate the electronic ground state for the proton potential, and we're going to get something like a symmetric double well potential when it's ready to tunnel. And then we calculate the vibrational ground state and first excited state, and you get a symmetric and anti-symmetric wave function. The splitting between them is just the tunneling splitting. It's delta. In this case, the vibronic coupling is delta over 2. Now, in the non-adiabatic case, we have these proton potentials that I've been talking about. We've got the blue one for the reactant and the red one for the product. Okay, in that case, it's actually the vibronic coupling is the electronic coupling times the overlap between the reactant and product proton vibrational wave functions. These are the phi's that I talked about before. Phi 1 mu, 1 means it's the reactant state, and mu means whichever level we're talking about. Here it's the ground state, so it would be 0. And phi 2 nu, that's the product state. So 2 means it's the product electronic state, and nu is whichever vibrational state within that we have. And again, it's going to be 0 in this case. That overlap here is important for determining the vibronic coupling in the non-adiabatic limit. Now, what happens if you're in between? All right. Well, it turns out that there's a general treatment of vibronic coupling that Georgievsky and Stuchet-Brukov derived. And we've applied it to different PCET reactions. And so what they did is they said, we can define an adiabaticity parameter, P, which is the ratio of the effective proton tunneling time and the electronic transition time. And these are defined in terms of the electronic coupling and some properties of the proton potential. And then they showed that the general vibronic coupling can be expressed as some prefactor kappa times the vibronic coupling in the adiabatic case, that delta over 2 I talked about on the previous slide. So just kappa times delta over 2. And this goes to the right limits if you are electronically non-adiabatic. So in this adiabaticity parameter, P is much, much less than 1, all right? Then you end up in this, this limit here, where you have the vibronic coupling being the electronic coupling times the overlap, right? So that means that the proton tunneling is actually quite fast, all right? Now, in the electronically adiabatic regime, when this adiabaticity parameter P is much, much greater than 1, right? And so the electrons are now really fast relative to the proton, so they can respond instantaneously. Now we get to the limit of delta over 2, that tunneling splitting over 2 that we had on the previous slide. But this general formulation can be actually very useful, especially for electrochemical PCET, where you can actually span these two regimes, and you might need to use this form of the vibronic coupling. So typically PCET reactions are vibronically non-adiabatic because this vibronic coupling is small. And this means we can use Fermi's golden rule to derive rate constant expressions. So again, here we have our stacked parabolas, right? For the reactant, we have blue. For the product, we have red. Here's the rate constant expression that we derived. It looks very similar to Marcus theory for electron transfer, but there are some important differences. These summations here over mu and nu, these are summations over the vibronic states, the reactant ones, the blue ones, and the product ones, the red ones. This P mu, this is the Boltzmann population of reactant state mu. Now you can see each term depends exponentially on a free energy barrier, which can be expressed in terms of delta G naught, right? That's the this free energy between the whichever pair of states you're looking at, and lambda, which we assume is constant, the same for all states. You don't have to, but we tend to because it's a good approximation and it makes life simpler. But delta G naught, of course, is going to depend on whichever pair of states you have, right? Because it's the relative free energies of their two minima. Each term also depends on the square of the vibronic coupling, this V mu nu that I've been talking about before, right? The vibronic coupling between that particular pair of states. Now, if we're in this electronically non-adiabatic regime I was talking about before, that vibronic coupling is the electronic coupling times the overlap between the reactant and product proton vibrational wave functions. That overlap here, that's shown right here in purple. That's also shown up here in magenta. That overlap plays a very important role in determining the rates and kinetic isotope effects of PCET reactions. Now, even if we were not in the electronically non-adiabatic regime, it would still play an important role. But I'm going to stick to this regime because it's a little more straightforward to explain. So how does this overlap affect the rates and kinetic isotope effects? Well, first of all, it's important to realize it depends very strongly on the proton donor-acceptor distance. We're going to call this capital R. As we increase this distance, so we pull the donor and acceptor apart, that overlap is clearly going to go down. So what we find is that the rate constant is proportional to the hydrogen overlap squared. Then the rate will decrease as the overlap decreases. It's pretty straightforward. The kinetic isotope effect is a little more interesting. That's the rate constant of hydrogen over the rate constant of deuterium. And that's proportional to the square of the hydrogen overlap over the square of the deuterium overlap for each pair of vibronic states. So what does that look like? Well, down here I show these, the solid lines are hydrogen, the dashed lines are deuterium, and I show the proton vibrational wave functions. You can see hydrogen has a greater overlap than deuterium, right? The solid lines have a bigger overlap than the dashed lines, and that's because the proton's lighter, so it's going to be more delocalized. That makes sense. Both of these overlaps are going to decrease as we pull the donor and the acceptor apart. But it turned out that deuterium falls off faster because of its larger mass. You can actually just derive this using harmonic oscillators. And so if you plot the ratio of these overlaps squared as a function of R, that's the donor-acceptor distance, you see that it increases dramatically. So that means that the rate constant is going to depend very strongly on this proton donor-acceptor distance. And so will the kinetic isotope effects. So we need to include the proton donor-acceptor motion in our theory. So as an example, here's a molecule that if we remove the electron, the proton transfers from this oxygen to this nitrogen. In this case, this R that I've been talking about, this capital R, is the oxygen-nitrogen distance. It's important to keep this coordinate separated from the other ones we've talked about. We've talked about collective solvent coordinates. Remember, that has to do with how the solvent reorganizes when the charge transfer occurs. So it's the solvent polarization in some sense. And we've talked about the proton coordinates. That has to do with moving the proton from where it starts to where it finishes and marching along and getting those proton potentials. Now we're talking about a different coordinate, capital R, which is this oxygen-nitrogen distance in this particular case. And what you can see is just a normal thermal fluctuation of this molecule changes that distance. And that's, of course, going to change the overlap we were just looking at between the proton vibrational wave functions, which affects the rate constants and the kinetic isotope effects a lot. All right, so we need to include this in our theory, and we've done this in two different ways. First, we've derived analytical rate constant expressions in various regimes where we approximate the overlap as decreasing exponentially with R. An alternative, though, is to do thermal averaging, where what you do is you say, okay, let's calculate the rate constant at a given value of R and weight it by the probability of sampling that value of R. So we have a probability distribution function, P of R, that tells us this probability. We do this for a series of different R values, and then we just integrate over R. Now, we've shown analytically that these two methods become mathematically equivalent in certain well-defined regimes. But it turns out that the thermal averaging, even though it's nice to have analytical expressions, it's appealing, it turns out the thermal averaging is a little bit more robust because it avoids this assumption of the exponential decrease of the overlap. So what I'm going to talk about for today, we're going to be using this thermal averaging procedure. Now, I want to point out that there are related theories, right? This was not done in a vacuum. So we have Casey Hines and coworkers who developed a theory of proton transfer. And they also treat the proton quantum mechanically, and they talk about the dependence on the solvent coordinate and the proton donor-acceptor distance R. In their case, they have only two states. Like they're looking at proton transfer, so they have only the two proton transfer states. And we have, of course, four states with the electron transfer, but still many of the concepts actually carry over. Now, Cuvier extended Marcus' theory for electron transfer to PCET, and he got the same kind of overlap prefect, and he applied it to different PCET systems in collaboration with Landau-Zener, who was doing experiments on PCET. That method, those rate constants did not include excited vibronic states or the dependence on R, the proton donor acceptor distance, which I've shown you are very important, and I'll show you later as well in some applications. Those are actually very important for understanding and interpreting experimental data. They did not extend it to electrochemistry either, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But nevertheless, this is, again, important to realize these are important, key contributions to the field. So what I've covered so far are the fundamental concepts of PCET theory. And now I'm going to move on to homogeneous electrochemical PCET theory, with three different parts. First, I'll talk about the rate constant expressions, then how do we calculate the input quantities, and then an illustrative application, which will hopefully explain how you put it all together. Each one of these is a relatively short section. So homogeneous electrochemical PCET, I already defined it to be the case where the electrode serves as a reservoir for electrons, but it does not take part in the chemistry. It's not involved in the bond breaking or forming. The proton transfer is happening within a solute complex. It could be within a hydrogen bonded complex, to be going to solvent, to some other species in solution, but it's not going to the electrode. The electrode is giving and taking electrons. So we've extended our vibronically non-adiabatic PCET theory to homogeneous electrochemical PCET. And it actually looks very similar to what I've already been talking about, except now we have a continuum of electronic states in the metal electrode. So our solute complex still is a single parabola, like this blue parabola, but now we have this continuum of electronic states over here. It gets a little more complicated. Delta G now depends on the applied potential of the electrode. And we need to worry about electrical double layer effects. What are the solvent and ions doing at this interface, and how does that affect the electrostatic potential that this solute complex is feeling? So we've extended the theory that I've been talking about to this case. And it looks a little bit complicated, but it's actually the same physics that we've been talking about we still have the summations here over mu and nu. These are over those stacked parabolas. The blue and the red parabolas right here. Again, the reactant and product vibronic states. We still have P mu, right? That's the Boltzmann population of the reactant vibronic state. We still have a square of the coupling here, right? Square of the vibronic coupling. Now we need to integrate over the 1 electron states of the electrode, weighting by the Fermi distribution and the density of states. But we still have the exponential of the free energy barrier in here, as we had before. It looks a little bit more complicated though. So delta G in some sense has a little bit of extra stuff in it because it's electrochemical. So this delta U mu nu, that's essentially the energy difference between vibronic states mu and nu. This epsilon is just the energy of the 1 electron state in the electrode. Eta is the overpotential relative to a formal electrode potential. This phi sub s is the electrostatic potential at x. Okay, and that's going to be affected by the dielectrical double layer. So I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. But here we have an anodic and a cathodic rate constant expression that depends on R. That's the distance between the proton donor and acceptor that we've been talking about this whole time. It also depends on X. That's the distance of this redox molecule from the electrode. So they're actually introducing yet another coordinate, which is the distance of, in some, the electron donor to the electrode. So this expression is a function of it's also going to depend on the applied potential, right? The over potential, whatever potential you're applying to the electrode. So it does depend on all three of these quantities. But what about this phi s? How are we going to calculate the electrostatic potential at x? And so we know that the general structure from just Gooey-Chapman-Stern theory, we know that we have a layer, an inner Helmholtz layer that consists of solvent that's organized near the electrode. And then we have an outer Helmholtz layer that's defined in terms of the solvated ions. And then we have a diffuse layer. This general structure is well accepted, at least in a qualitative way. So we've extended this Gooey-Chapman-Stern model using a multi-layer dielectric continuum, where we have, for the inner Helmholtz layer, we just have a dielectric constant that's proportional to n squared or approximately equal to n squared, the refractive index. We have an outer Helmholtz layer with a dielectric constant that will be a function of the applied potential or the electric field associated with it. And then we have a diffuse layer, where we have the dielectric constant of the solvent, the bulk solvent out here. And so what we do is we solve the Laplace and Langevin, Poisson, Boltzmann equation self-consistently for each electrode potential E. That gives us each one of these different colored lines here. And what you see is the electrostatic potential increases linearly in the inner Helmholtz layer and in the outer Helmholtz layer. Most of the increase is happening in the inner Helmholtz layer, but a little bit is still happening in the outer Helmholtz layer. This is a very simplistic picture of the electrical double layer. There are many more sophisticated models available, and I think one can give an entire talk on this. In fact, probably someone in the series is giving an entire talk on modeling the electrical double layer. I'm not going to go into the details. From the perspective of PCET theory, we really just need to know what this electrostatic potential, phi sub s, is as a function of x, so that we can plug it into our rate constant expression. So you can use any model you want to use to get this quantity. This is just one simple model that you could use if you want to keep life simple. Okay, so we have this anodic and cathodic rate constants, and again, they depend on R, the proton donor acceptor distance. And so then we're going to do our thermal averaging procedure, where we have P of R, that's the probability distribution as a function of R, and we weight each anodic rate constant that we calculate for different values of R, and we just integrate. And we're going to do that for the cathodic as well. All right, so we have our P of R, we get rid of R by integrating over it, if we know the probability distribution function. This is all happening within the solute complex, right? We also have X, the distance of the molecule from the electrode. If we want to calculate a current density, we're going to have to integrate over that distance X between the redox molecule and the electrode. Now there, we're going to weight by the concentrations of the reduced and oxidized species. And you can see that integral here. Here's our anodic rate constant, depends on X. We're going to weight it by the concentration of the reduced species in this case, and then by the oxidized species in this case. And then we can get current densities that depend on eta, the overpotential. So this is the general procedure that you can use to extend the PCET theory concepts to electrochemical PCET and get a quantity that then you can compare directly to experiments. So now the question is, how do we calculate the input quantities to all this? So we have the formalism, but how do we actually use it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we calculate each of these input quantities. So the total reorganization energy is the sum of the inner sphere reorganization energy, which has to do with how the solute changes, the geometry of the solute changes, and the outer sphere reorganization energy, which has to do with how the solvent changes when the charge transfer reaction happens. I'll talk about how we calculate each one of these quantities, and then I'll talk a little bit about electronic coupling, and then how we generate the proton potentials, the wave functions, and the energies, and how we get this proton donor-acceptor probability distribution function we need for the thermal averaging procedure. All right, starting with inner sphere reorganization energy. Again, this has to do with how the solute geometry changes upon, say, electron transport PCET. So one way to do this is to just look at the sum of the energies arising from bond length changes, delta xj, between the oxidized and reduced states. So that's what the summation is. It's over vibrational modes. These are force constants, F of the reactant and product, and delta X is just the change in the bond length. This has been done for electron transfer long ago. We don't tend to use that as much for PCET, although you certainly can. We use this 4-point scheme, where you optimize the geometries of the oxidized state, and that's going to give you the geometry QOX, and of the reduced state, that's going to give you what we call QRed. So what you do is you say, okay, I have the energy of the oxidized state at its geometry, and I have the energy of the reduced state at its geometry. And then you say, now I want to calculate the energy of the oxidized state at the geometry for the reduced state. And the difference in these two energies is going to give us the inner sphere reorganization energy associated with the oxidized state. You can do the same thing for the reduced state here, and you get, again, two energies. And that's what this expression is for the inner sphere reorganization energy. It's just taking the average between the oxidized and reduced inner sphere reorganization energies. And this was done, I think, first by Nelson for electron transfer. And what we said is, okay, for proton PCET, there's a little bit something different here, because the oxidized state, or the reactant, you could say, is actually defined not only where the electron is, but where the proton is. So for example, if the oxidized state has the proton on the donor, okay, then what we need to do up here when we're looking at the oxidized state, even though we're at the reduced geometry, we need to optimize the hydrogen on the donor, because that's what corresponds to the oxidized state in PCET. We keep all other nuclei fixed and just optimize the hydrogen. And then we do the same thing on the other side. For the reduced state, we say, okay, the reduced state corresponds to the proton on the acceptor. So we'd better optimize the hydrogen on the acceptor when we look at this reduced state, even though we're at the oxidized geometry, so all the other nuclei are being fixed to that geometry. So it maybe sounds a little bit complicated, but it's actually very straightforward. You do two geometry optimizations, one for the oxidized state, one for the reduced state, and then you do two additional calculations where you only optimize the proton. Everything else is fixed, and you just change the state. And then you get these four energies. You combine them like this, and you have your inner sphere reorganization energy. What about outer sphere or solvent reorganization energy? Well, there are different ways to do this as well. Liu and Newton have a nice expression here for the outer sphere reorganization energy. It's an analytical expression that assumes a spherical cavity and a dielectric continuum solvent. So here's our sphere of radius A, and it's a distance d from the electrode. This delta Q here is the change in charge of the molecule. Usually it's 1 if you're plus or minus 1 if you're going to do like a just single electron transfer reaction. And we have the dielectric constants of the solvent. So then to use this for PCET or for electron transfer for that matter, how are you going to get the volume of the cavity? How do you get this distance A? And the way we do it is we say, okay, we're just going to do a density functional theory calculation with PCM. That's the polarizable continuum model. That defines a cavity around the molecule. You can see that down here for this particular molecule. And it gives the volume of this cavity. You can just say, I'm going to take that volume and set it equal to 4/3 pi r cubed, figure out what r is, and then that's my radius A. So it of course will work better for more spherical-like molecules, but we find that even if it's not a spherical molecule, it actually works fairly well to just get the volume that way and assume it's a sphere. And then you say, okay, how am I going to figure the distance? Well, sometimes you know, and if you don't know, you can say, well, let's just make it tangent to the electrode surface or some other choice out at the outer Helmholtz plane, however you want to define it. There are different ways to choose. but this is very easy to use and it gives you a reasonable results. If you want more elaborate dielectric continuum models, we've actually developed models where you can do molecular shaped cavity with PCM. You can include the effects of the electrode solvent boundary with external Green's function. So you can get as complicated as you want. Here we have an electrode and a solvent with a molecule in here. Here we added a SAM. So we added another layer of a low dielectric constant. And we also did PCET. If you want to go even further, you want to make it like even more complicated, you can do molecular dynamic simulations to get solvent reorganization energies. And there are a lot of people who've developed methods for that as well. Often it's easy to just use a simple analytical expression, but again, you can get as complicated as you want. All we need is that value. Now, electronic coupling is a tough one. That's the electronic coupling between the redox molecule and the electrode states. Now, typically it's assumed to be constant for electrode states near the Fermi level of the metal electrode. In principle, you can calculate with electronic structure methods such as constrained DFT. It can be challenging, but the squared electronic coupling is a prefactor in our rate constant expression, and it's actually not required if you're calculating relative rate constants or kinetic isotope effects. So in many cases, we can get away with not even calculating this at all, because often we're only interested in trends. And so for trends, you can, if you can choose a system where the electronic coupling is approximately the same, then you don't have to calculate it. If you have to calculate it, there's a literature of how to calculate electronic couplings. How about the proton potential? So this is something that's very specific to PCET. All the other input quantities really have been, general. You can do them for ET or PCET. But proton potentials are now special for PCET. What we want to do is we want to compute these proton potentials along a one-dimensional grid, right? This proton coordinate, that hydrogen coordinate I defined earlier, for each different R value. So for each different proton donor-acceptor distance. And that's what's shown here. So you can see that as this distance gets bigger, the different colors here, you can see that the barrier increases. And we have this for the reduced state and for the oxidized state. For the reduced state, you can see the asymmetry has this reactant well lower, or the donor well lower in energy, and the oxidized state has the acceptor well lower in energy. Okay, so the asymmetry is flipped just like we saw before in the fundamental concepts section of this talk. And you can see for different R values in both cases, the barrier is increasing. For each of these potentials, we can calculate the proton vibrational wave functions and energy levels numerically. We just solve the one-dimensional Schrodinger equation for the proton moving in the potential. This will give us overlap integrals and proton vibrational energy level splitting. So all of that comes out of it. Once you have the proton potentials, it's pretty straightforward. Now we also need this proton donor acceptor distance probability distribution function, this P of R, because we need that in the thermal averaging, because you need to look at a whole set of different R values and weight them accordingly. You could use a harmonic oscillator distribution function, or if you want to get fancier, you could use energies from a constrained geometry optimization. So you take the reactant and you do geometry optimizations with a constrained R value and get the energies as a function of R, and you could use that to get your P of R. Now, the best way to understand all this is to see an example. So I'm going to show an example of how we applied all those different methods and these theories to a homogeneous PCET reaction. This particular reaction in these BIP molecules were designed to mimic PCET in photosystem 2 for water oxidation. Okay, so this histidine-tyrosine pair, the very famous histidine-tyrosine pair in photosystem 2 is modeled by this BIP molecule. When you remove an electron, the proton transfers from this oxygen to this nitrogen. You can see that. This is the concerted EPT process. You can see the proton is now on the nitrogen. These are the 4 states in our square diagram, those 4 diabatic states I introduced way back. We've got 1A, 1B, 2A, and 2B. Remember, 1 and 2 are the electron transfer states. A and B are the proton transfer states. This allows us to describe sequential and concerted PCET. So sequential would correspond to going on the outside. We could do ET-PT or PT-ET, and concerted corresponds to going along the diagonal. We can look at all the energies of these different states, and we find that thermodynamically, this reaction is favored to go concertedly. It wants to avoid the high energy intermediates, so it will go directly from 1A to 2B. Now we're going to want to thermally average over the proton donor acceptor distance R. What is this distance? Well, for this particular molecule, the proton is transferring from an oxygen to a nitrogen. So R is the oxygen-nitrogen distance. So we have P of R times the rate constant is a function of R, and we're just going to integrate. So first we need this P of R. How are we going to get this? Well, what we do is we say, all right, let's just represent it as a harmonic probability distribution function, where the effective force constant and equilibrium distance can be obtained from the equilibrium geometries in ways that are discussed in these papers at the bottom of the slide. I won't go into the technical details, but you can get all the information you need. And so we then have the distribution function for, you can see this thermal motion right here. We have the distribution function for this motion, the oxygen-nitrogen distance. Okay, now what we want to do is get the proton potentials. So the first step is to generate average structures. So what we're going to do is we're going to optimize the reduced and the oxidized structures for different R values. So in R, again, is the oxygen-nitrogen distance here. And we're going to say, okay, let's set R equal to 3.0 angstroms. Right, we're going to do a constrained geometry optimization for the reduced species, get a geometry. And then we're going to take away an electron, and we're going to get the oxidized species, because now it's +1, right? And we're going to do the same thing, a constrained geometry optimization where R is constrained to 3.0. And we're going to do that constrained geometry optimization. We've got two geometries, we're going to overlay them and average them. That will give us a structure that we can use to generate our proton potentials, because we need one single structure to generate the proton potentials that will work for both reduced and oxidized states. All right, so we do this for a whole series of different R values. We might be 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6, and so forth for the different oxygen-nitrogen distances. So we get these sets of proton potentials. So how are we going to get the proton potentials from these average geometries that we got for the different R values? So first we need to define our proton coordinate. So remember, I showed before, we can optimize the proton on the oxygen, or we can optimize the proton on the nitrogen. That would be for the reduced form when it's on the oxygen, and for the oxidized form when it's on the nitrogen. So we have these two positions that we optimize for each state, reduced and oxidized. We don't actually have two protons at any one time. These are just the positions that they would be in. We only have one proton here. But this allows us to define our grid. Right, this again is that hydrogen coordinate that I introduced way back. In fact, I use the same exact figure back there. So this is the hydrogen coordinate. We're going to march the proton along this axis to get those proton potentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, here's our axis, here's our proton, and we're going to march it along and do single point energy calculations with all other nuclei fixed. And we're going to get the proton potential. And you can see this happening. These are all from single point energy calculations. That's where we got this proton potential from. And you can see the donor well is lower in energy. That's because this was done for the reactive state, all right, for the reduced state. So once we have the proton potentials, we can then calculate the proton vibrational wave functions, and we can get overlaps and vibrational energy levels and so forth. And you can see this one, I mentioned at the very beginning that the harmonic approximation for proton potentials is not good, right? You can see this one even has a minimum, a local minimum on this side. So you'd never capture this if you just treated this as a harmonic potential. So doing this and getting the explicit proton potential is actually a very important part of understanding PCET reactions. Then you can calculate the inner sphere and outer sphere reorganization energies using the methods that I talked about before. All right, and you have those together with these proton potentials that I already introduced as a function of different R values. And then we got all the wave functions on top of them and so forth to get the overlaps and vibrational energy levels. We plug all of this into the rate constant expression and calculate the PCET rate constant. We don't worry about the electronic coupling in this particular application because we were interested in relative rate constants or kinetic isotope effects. So how does it do? Well, here's the kinetic isotope effect that was calculated. We get a value of 2.0. The experimental value is 1.8 plus or minus 0.3. So it does pretty well. Okay, so the kinetic isotope effect is in good agreement with the experimental value. But we can do more than just reproduce a number. We can understand what's happening. So first we look at the dominant proton donor acceptor distance. Remember, we're doing this thermal averaging procedure, but we can see which R value contributes the most to the rate constant. And in this case, we find that 2.48 angstroms contributes the most. That's actually shorter than the equilibrium distance, which is around 2.6 angstroms. And that's because the overlap is larger at smaller distances, and that's going to favor the smaller distances, even if P of R is going to favor the larger distance. So it's this balance between those two. And then we can look at the percentage contributions of the different pairs of vibronic states. And we find that the 1,0 state dominates in this case. The first excited proton vibrational state of the reactant and the ground proton vibrational state of the product. Now, the contributions of these pairs of vibronic states is determined by a balance of several factors. First of all, the Boltzmann population of the reactant state, then the overlap or the vibronic coupling, and then the free energy barrier, right, for that particular pair. We can see that in this picture right here, where we have now a very simplified version where we have only two reactant parabolas that are stacked, right? Remember, the lowest one corresponds to the ground proton vibrational state, and the first excited one corresponds to the first excited proton vibrational state. And then I'm only showing one product state, just to keep things simple. That's just the ground proton vibrational state. These things in the blue and red circles, those are the proton potentials that depend on that hydrogen coordinate, the proton coordinate that I've defined a while ago in my talk. So those are along the proton coordinate. These parabolas, the blue ones and the red ones, are along the collective solvent coordinate. So you see we have two pairs of vibronic states in this case, 0, 0 and 1, 0. And the relative contributions of those two pairs will depend on a balance of those three factors I mentioned on the previous slide. The first factor is the Boltzmann population of the reactant state, which tends to favor the ground state, right? So it's going to favor the 0, 0 pair. The second factor is the overlap, which tends to favor, in this case, it'll favor the excited vibrational state because it's more delocalized, it's going to have greater overlap to this one. And then the third factor is the free energy barrier. The free energy barrier is from the blue minimum up to this crossing point here, for this blue minimum to this crossing point. Clearly, the free energy barrier is lower, right, for the 1, 0 state. That's going to favor the 1, 0 state. And so then you have to plug it into the rate constant expression and see which pair wins. Right? In the case of this previous slide, it was the 1, 0 pair that won. Now, I already mentioned that the kinetic isotope effect is proportional to the square of the hydrogen overlap or the square of the deuterium overlap for each pair of states. And this ratio increases as the overlap decreases, right? That we showed in a previous slide. And these two aspects, the excited vibronic states and this general trend of the ratio of overlaps, they allow us to interpret the kinetic isotope effects for PCET reactions. So, for example, if we think of the enzyme soybean lipoxygenase, which has a huge kinetic isotope effect of 80 at room temperature and up to 700 for a double mutant, so they can replace one hydrogen with deuterium and get this huge effect. It's with CH bond breaking in this case. In this case, when we analyze the PCET theory, we find that the 0, 0 pair dominates, and it has very small overlap. You can see this purple region here, and that is what leads to the large kinetic isotope effect. But for these systems I was talking about on the previous slides, this BIP molecule, we found that the 1, 0 pair dominates. You can see here, this is going to have intermediate overlap. Imagine shifting this red line up and calculating the overlap between the red and the blue wave functions. Intermediate overlap will lead to a kinetic isotope effect, a moderate one of around 2. Now, if we add a porphyrin group to this BIP molecule, it turns out the proton potentials change in a way that now the 0, 1 pair dominates. Okay, that's the ground proton vibrational state for the reactant and the first excited proton vibrational state for the product. And their overlap is nearly unity. So it turns out in that case, you get a kinetic isotope effect around 1. And that was also seen experimentally. And there are other cases when the kinetic isotope effect is 1 as well. So contributions from excited states can actually decrease the kinetic isotope effect. And so this is important to realize, is that often experimentalists use the kinetic isotope effect as a litmus test for whether the proton is transferring or not. And so they say, if there's a kinetic isotope effect, the proton is transferring. If not, then it's not, right? But in this case, we have no kinetic isotope effect, or it's 1, and we know the proton is transferring. So what we see on this slide is the kinetic isotope effect could be anything from 1 all the way up to 700, depending on which pair of vibronic states are contributing and what their overlaps are. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, so far, I've only been talking about 1 electron and 1 proton cases. Are multi-state continuum theories actually applicable to multi-electron, multi-proton systems, where you have 2 to the n states and n collective solvent coordinates for n charge transfer reactions. So far, we've had 1 electron and 1 proton, so n is 2. So we have 4 states. Remember, our 4 diabatic states I introduced in the square model. And n collective solvent coordinates means we have 2 collective solvent coordinates. That was the paraboloids I showed before. Now, what if we want to take these BIP molecules and add another substituent and get a second proton to go? Right? Then we're going to call this E2PT. So we have a double proton transfer. Now we have to worry about the fact that we have 1 electron and 2 protons, right? So that's n equals 3. So we need actually 2 cubed. We need 8 states. So instead of a square diagram, we actually have a cube. And so if you use the labeling we had before, where 1 and 2 is the electron transfer and state, and A and B are the proton transfer states, now we've got 2 protons. So we've got 1 AA going to 2 BB, means that the electron and both protons transferred. And when you look at this cube diagram, we find that for this particular molecule, it's thermodynamically favorable for both protons to go. So it is indeed what we call an E2PT reaction. Now, if we have 2 protons, another thing we need to think about is we need to have multidimensional proton potentials. We've only had one-dimensional proton potential so far, but now we have 2 protons, one going from oxygen to nitrogen and one going between these 2 nitrogens. So when we plot the proton potentials, we actually need a 2-dimensional grid. This axis is the oxygen-nitrogen proton, and this one's the nitrogen-nitrogen proton. So as we move the protons on their grid, we'll keep one of them fixed and move the other one along its grid, then move it to the next grid point, move the other one, and we get different rows of this grid. And we have to do 2-dimensional proton potentials and 2-dimensional wave functions. But the overlaps, once we have them, we plug them into the exact same rate constant expression that I've been talking about. So that does not get more complicated. It's just how we get the input quantities, how we get those overlaps is a little more complicated when you have multiple protons. But all of it is extendable to multi-electron, multi-proton PCET. In fact, we've used PCET theory to help design long-range proton translocation in these systems. We went from E2PT to E3PT to E4PT. So we've gotten PCET to reversibly move protons up to 16 angstroms across a hydrogen bonded network. And this was confirmed by IR spectroelectrochemistry. And these are all reversible. You can see from the CVs here. So this is an example of how theory can help guide the design of interesting molecules as well. So I want to just talk one slide about an application from Yang Xiaohorn's group. So this was an application that did not involve my group at all. They looked at the oxygen reduction reaction, ORR, at an interfacial layer of a protic ionic liquid on platinum and gold. And it's a concerted PCET reaction in the sense that PCET from the protic cation here to an adsorbed species, in this case it's OOH on gold, that occurs simultaneously with electron transfer from the electrode to give the product here, or on platinum, it's an OH adsorbed species, but again, leads to this nitrogen in this case. So this is actually a heterogeneous PCET reaction according to the definitions I already gave, but they use our homogeneous PCET rate constant expression where they just treat this protic cation and adsorbed species as a molecular species in implicit solvent, and they neglect the effects of the electrode and the potential, which worked out fine for them. So in some cases, you can actually do that and save yourself some trouble. And you can see they have proton potentials here. They have a solvent coordinate. They have the parabolas. Their proton potentials are not, harmonic. They've got the local minimum here. They get the proton wave functions. Here, the 0-3 pair is dominant. Here, the 1-0 pair is dominant. And they were able to explain their results, the dependence of ORR activity on the pKa of the ionic liquid in terms of stronger hydrogen bonds with a greater overlap for the dominant pair of vibronic states. So this helped them interpret their experimental data. So now I'm going to take a break. I know we've been going around an hour now. So, and the second part, which is really the last third, will start after I give people a chance to ask questions or just get up and walk around and get a drink or whatever. So I'd be happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Just a second, let me unmute the audience. So please feel free to ask your questions directly. Please go ahead, Tom.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for a wonderful talk so far. I did have a question about the electrochemical system, the outer sphere one. There is an orientation of this proton transfer pathway that didn't seem to be in your model, right? And so this molecule is in a local electric field, right? And is free to orient any which way. Maybe I just missed that.
Right. So you're talking about the application that I was talking about. Let me bring this slide.
When you have a outer sphere electron transfer to a molecule that can undergo PCET, kind of back towards the beginning of your talk.
So something like this molecule, this picture here.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. You're saying there's an orientation of where, yeah, I mean, we drew it obviously in a simple way. This is going to be moving around in solution.
Right, right, and can reorient within that, and there's an electric field there in the other way. Does that make a difference?
Right, you're saying if the molecule itself had a dipole moment, then it could interact with the field in different ways depending on its orientation. Yeah, I mean, the theory does not include that. You know, I guess the essential assumption is that you're really averaging over all orientations and that there's no real, significant orientational effect. That it's really, that it's the field at the molecule. So you can sort of, here I'm sort of defining it to be at the electron donor, right? But you can sort of, so I think it is, I think what you bring up is a very important point, Tom, which is that there are many approximations underlying these theories. And so, there could be a very long list of approximations, and that's one of many, is that we are not really including orientational effects. You just assume you're really just sort of averaging overall orientation.
Oh, okay, yeah, because it seemed like there'd be a big dipole change when the proton moves, right, along that.
Not as much as you might think, because when the proton moves, right, it's only moving in usually like a few tenths of an angstrom.
Oh, okay.
Right, so the big dipole, the big charge changes when the electron transfers over much larger distances. So in PCET, for example, the reorganization energy tends to be dominated by electron transfer, because electron will transfer, at least 5 angstroms, sometimes more, 10, 15, whatever. It transfers a long ways, whereas the proton, because it can only, proton can only transfer over, say, 0.3 or 0.5 angstroms in each step. You could have a proton relay with lots of different ones, but each proton is really not moving that much. So I think the dipole moment change is overall is not huge when the proton moves that few tenths of an angstrom. Whereas when the electron moves, then you get a huge change in charge distribution.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And it is, we are just assuming that it's, again, thermally averaging. You also assume when, often that it's spherical if you're using that simple analytical formula for the outer sphere reorganization energy as well.
Thank you. Sharon, there is another question from the YouTube, and then we'll get back to Zoom questions. So Brian asks is on the side with the kinetic isotope effects of the PCET for the BIP porphyrines, the vibrational excited states of the product has substantial component of its wave function on the reactant well. So is that something that one can see in the IR spectra?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So this is so you're saying that in this particular one, right? That, well, either one, that you basically do have the product has a little bit on the reactant side. The product wave function can end up having, and then there's going to be I think you will not see it spectroscopically, because it will do vibrational relaxation very quickly. So in the end, the proton will end up on its acceptor. So I don't think you can isolate that species. It's just it's going to relax too quickly.
Even with a prompt probe experiment?
It's possible people could. We have also done non-equilibrium dynamics. Like I have a movie, but I don't have it in this particular talk, but we've looked at, for example, the non-equilibrium dynamics of when after you remove an electron from this, and you can look at the 2 protons going, and you can actually see there's a delay between the 2 proton transfers. And I think it's possible that 2-dimensional IR will be able to resolve those different timescales of the delay in the proton transfer and the delay between the 2 proton transfers. So those kinds of things, I think, in principle, could be resolved spectroscopically. And of course, the techniques for spectroscopy are getting better and better every day. So I guess I would say never, but whether you can sort of isolate, if it goes into an excited vibrational state, whether it's on the donor side or the acceptor side, whether you can resolve that before it thermally relaxes, vibrational relaxation down to its ground vibrational state. I guess I don't think it's been done yet, but I think, if never say never, right? The techniques are getting better. In
principle, it should be doable, provided that we have the sufficient.
If you have the sufficient time scale resolution, right? I think it would be challenging, though.
Yeah. Oh yes, yeah. Okay, thank you. We have a question from Maximilian.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. Thank you for the incredible talk. I hope this question is not too off topic. I'm thinking about a reaction on a battery electrode, for example, lithium metal. And I think there's also this reaction happen, right? So there's a coupled effect. And I was just wondering if this theory is already applied to this kind of reactions, so battery electrode reactions. because I think it could be kind of easier, right? Because if the electron is just a Fermi gas with some surface states.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that it could be applicable to it. We have not done it as far as we know. It hasn't been done, but there's no reason it cannot be done with batteries. So I think that it would be a good and interesting application. I'm sure it will be done, but it hasn't yet. Yeah, the challenge. Well, I'll talk about the challenges at the end, but of course, is to just describe the interfacial region accurately enough in that case to be able to get the input quantities to the rate constant expressions. But in principle, it can be done, absolutely.
Hello, Sharon. This is Rudolph Marcus. Can you hear me?
Hi, Rudy. Yes, I can.
First of all, wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was also interested in seeing that for the electrochemical, you had the expression containing the dielectric image effect. The expression that you had for lambda, I guess it was.
Right, for outer sphere
For electrode, yeah. And I understand, whether there is such an effect or not was a point of contention back around 1960. I had it in that my formula, and the other person didn't. But somebody called my attention recently to some direct experimental evidence for the dielectric image effect. But have you seen that? If so, that would be supportive of at least qualitatively of the formula that you wrote down.
Yeah, I mean, the support I have for this formula, I'm not fully aware of what the work you're talking about that came out recently, but when we did these more elaborate solvent reorganization energy models where we had the cavity around the molecule and we had the Green's functions, and we compared it to this very simple spherical model, they were very similar, almost the same numbers, almost indistinguishable. And we compared to experimental data on reorganization energies for series of different molecules. I don't remember, maybe there were 20 or even more different molecules, and the agreement was quite good with the experiment.
Right, and was that for reactions in solution or for the reaction at electrode?
It was electrochemical. It was electrochemical. It was molecules near electrodes, and we compared to this paper, I think right here, the 2014 paper. I think this one is the one that has like a table of numbers comparing to experiments, and it was just electron transfer, not even PCET, just electron transfer, and it agreed very well with experiments. That doesn't, that's sort of empirical evidence, but it does seem to.
No, it's good to hear that, and I'll certainly look it up right after your talk.
Yeah, I can send that paper to you. But
right.
We have evidence. This formula works, surprisingly well. I think so it seems to have the right physics in it, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Eric. I think you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. So in a lot of your calculations, you keep the other positions, the other atoms fixed while you move the proton, and implicitly assume that the proton transfer is always the bottleneck of the reaction. I was wondering whether sometimes you also perform full-dimensional searches for minimum energy crossing points, because I could imagine that sometimes the other atoms could arrange in a way to create a much lower barrier where the proton doesn't have to move. Then you could, the electronic transition could take place there, and afterwards the proton just basically slides down, or the molecule on the product state.
Yeah, I mean, it's what underlies all of this in some sense is that collective solvent coordinate. You could, I'd call it a collective solvent coordinate, but you could also view that it also includes inner sphere reorganization, right? So the fact that I'm saying that our inner sphere our reorganization is the sum of inner sphere and outer sphere, that axis should probably, if you really want it to be rigorous, should includes in some sense reorganization of the molecule as well. So when we're including this inner sphere reorganization energy, effectively we're including the solute reorganization that would also. So when you say the proton's the bottleneck, well, the solute reorganization is also in there. It's in the free energy barrier, right, through that inner sphere reorganization energy. But you're right, it's all assuming there's that separation, right, between solute reorganization energy and the proton. We are treating the proton in a special way in some sense by doing that treatment where we fix everything. In answer to your question, have we looked at the case? So the case you're talking about where say we have looked at for photo-induced PCET. So you photo-excited, say to an excited electronic state, right? And then like you say, the barrier could be completely gone in the excited electronic state. And so then the proton will slide right down. And so in that case, we would not use, for example, Fermi's golden rule. It wouldn't be appropriate, right? Because Fermi's golden rule assumes you're, in some sense, it assumes you have a chance to reach a quasi-equilibrium state before the reaction happens. If you photoexcite to an excited electronic state, then and suddenly the potential energy surface is different, and like this sliding motion mentioned, then you have to really use just non-equilibrium explicit dynamics, and that's what we do for photo-induced PCET. So we do see that situation, and when in that situation, you might have to do explicit dynamics, and that would be what I would recommend. I mean, it's difficult to trying to find, like you say, crossing points and minimum energy paths and such. If the reaction is fully adiabatic and you don't think the hydrogen, quantum effects are at all important, then yeah, you could just find a transition state and a barrier and plug into transition state theory. I think in many of these cases, as I showed some examples, for example, if you had an isotope effect of 80 or something, clearly that sort of approach will not work. And you have to include the hydrogen tunneling effects and the quantum effects of the proton and excited vibrational states in many cases. So I think it will be system dependent. But you are right, again, pointing out that there are assumptions underlying this theory that are kind of unavoidable assumptions. I listened to Rudy's presentation for this colloquium on electron transfer, and I liked the phrase he said, where he said, you could assume that the frequencies are different for the two parabolas, but things get really messy, so he assumed that they were the same. And sometimes when you're developing theories, you do have to, simplify life by making these assumptions just to make it usable, right? And so, but you are sometimes missing some of the physics, but hopefully capturing the essential physics.
I see. Thank you. Maybe a quick follow-up on the slide where you introduced the first time your formula for the PCET. So like the Fermi golden rule based formula. Could you maybe explain what the difference there is to like the Marcus-Levitt-Jortner theory, where you also have this separation between a system and a bath?
Right. So in that theory, typically they're talking about other solute modes, right? So there are some connections. You're absolutely right. Typically, those are assumed to be harmonic, I think, in most of those theories, and they're also assumed to be uncoupled to the solvent, right? Whereas the solute modes that are added there, whereas in this case, the proton, because it's a charge transfer reaction, right, it's actually coupled to the solvent. So you have to, that's why you need the two collective solvent coordinates to get for these paraboloids, right, which you wouldn't need, I think, in their theory, right? And so you have these, two collective solvent coordinates. So I think those are the key differences, but of course there are similarities because in some limits of that theory, right, they also have like a Frank-Condon type overlap factor in front due to the solute modes. But I think the key, one important part here is that the proton transfer is, you cannot describe it as a harmonic potential because of what you see, the anharmonic, the proton potential can look quite different, and you can see proton vibrational states can be localized on the opposite side, which affects, when you sum over all of them, it affects the contributions from the different vibronic states. So the harmonic treatment of that sort would not work here. It would not, be realistic. But there are definitely connections. You're right.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, can I ask a couple of questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for a very nice and very interesting talk. I have a couple of questions. The first question is, did you employ the Landau-Zener theory when calculating or when estimating such quantities like electronic and proton transmission coefficients? And the second question is about the inner sphere, intramolecular contribution to the reorganization energy. Do you mean that in this case we treat the proton or the hydrogen atom coordinate as a classical one, so that it contributes to the barrier, energy barrier, but doesn't contribute to the tunneling factor? Or do you mean other degrees of freedom because you consider complicated molecules with a lot of intermolecular coordinates? Okay.
Right, the good question. So in terms of the Landau-Zener, I'll be talking about that a little bit more in the second part or the last third. But in some sense, right, this is Fermi's golden rule. So the physical meaning of this rate constant here, right, this exponential part is related to the probability of going from the reactant minimum to the crossing point, right? And then this square of the coupling here is related to the probability of tunneling once you've reached this crossing point. So that's really the framework we're moving in. I mean, it's of course related to Landau-Zener theory, but I will mention that more explicitly in the second part, like I said. But the question about inner sphere actually is a very important question that I want to address. So in this case, inner sphere reorganization energy does not include the transferring proton. The transferring proton is quantum mechanical. So it's not part of this inner sphere reorganization energy, right? This is all of the other nuclei reorganizing. So it's the same way in Marcus theory, right? When the electron transfers, you wouldn't include the electron as one of the coordinates in inner, and you know, if the proton is sort of should be viewed kind of like an electron in the sense that it's quantum mechanical. So it's not, we're looking at vibronic states. So the proton's already in the vibronic state. So these energies here, that's exactly why when we sort of translated this force point scheme to PCET, that's exactly why we need to optimize the proton on the other side in some sense to account for the fact that that's not done naturally, right? When you're treating your nuclei classically, when you're doing, say, a DFT calculation, that the electron you can kind of constrain to be on the donor or the acceptor, or if it's a reduced or oxidized state, you can just take the electron off to oxidize it. That can be done fairly straightforwardly, but the proton, if it's quantum mechanical, we sort of want to account for that exact point that you're making by optimizing the proton on the donor or the acceptor to be associated with the state where it should be. But that again is an approximation. It's an approximate way to do it. So, but the inner sphere reorganization energy does not involve the proton motion at all. The proton motion is separate. The donor acceptor mode also is separate, typically, right? That the R value that we talk about is also in some sense treated separately as an explicit reaction coordinate.
Okay, thank you.
Simon, do you want to ask a question?
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon. My quick question was on the kinetic isotope effect. You mentioned the importance of the overlaps and comparing those for the isotopes. I just wanted to clarify, we're really looking at coupling between the wave functions, and we're approximating the coupling by the overlap. Is that right?
To some extent, yes. So right, this vibronic coupling here, right? This vibronic coupling in the non-adiabatic regime is the electronic coupling times this overlap. So yes, it's the coupling is it sort of the constant electronic coupling times the overlap. So I often just talk about the overlap, but essentially that is the vibronic coupling. And if you were in, say, this intermediate regime where you had to use this more general vibronic couplings, then it would be more accurate to really talk about the vibronic coupling. So yes, it is the vibronic coupling that is determining the kinetic isotope effect. And if it had this form, it would still be, the general form would still be affecting the kinetic isotope effect. It's just in many cases we look at, we are able to use this expression of electronic coupling times overlap. So I just replace the word vibronic coupling with overlap because it's easier to understand this. If you use coupling, a lot of people from electron transfer think you mean electronic coupling. And that's what gets confusing. So that's why talking about overlap makes it really clear that this is not an electronic coupling, it's a vibronic coupling.
Yeah, I just asked this because I do electronic coupling, and there is also the approximation there that the electronic coupling can be approximated by the overlap of the diabatic states, which is an approximation, which has its limitations. And so, I would assume so here then that there are cases where this overlap approximation fails, but probably this is not a dominant or important thing. Have you noticed that this approximation could become troublesome for some systems? Because in coupling, you generally need a perturbation which couples two wave functions. And
right. Well, so this general vibronic coupling, this was derived by Georgevsky and Stuter-Brukov, and this also is basically a Landau-Zener type approach, by the way, for that. Harkening back to that question that was earlier, the way they derive this. So this, in some sense, it should cover cases where it's not just the overlap. This is so I think this would account for the concern that you have. This will span kind of the adiabatic and non-adiabatic regimes. So but even this, of course, is still an approximation that relies on sort of two diabatic state coupling. So, but I think we haven't found any cases where, I mean, we have found cases where we can't just use the electronic coupling hence the overlap, where we need to use the more general form. I'm going to actually talk about one of those in a few minutes. So we have definitely found that case, and maybe if that's what you're referring to, then yes, we have seen that. But the general form seems to be, pretty robust, at least in our hands.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Sharon, can I ask you one more question before we continue? So if you can go to the slide where you show the electrode molecule interaction.
Let's see, something like that.
Something like this, yeah. So I'm curious about the potential. So when that molecule becomes really big and then that comes really close to the electrode, I would expect that the electron would be in a completely different potential than the proton on the other side of the molecule, right? So is it something that should be taken into account when you calculate the rate?
The electrostatic potential you're talking
Yes,
about.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it is true, and that kind of goes back to Tom Malouk's question about, so this is an approximation. You could say put it in the center of the molecule, put it at the electron donor. So yeah, it's going to be, you're right, it's going to vary over the molecule itself. So you just have to choose a value. I guess in principle you could try to average, like have different values and then average. We are averaging over X, so we are moving the actual molecule over X, but we're not, so in some sense we're capturing some of that when we do that. I think that integral over X right here, right, we are in some sense calculating a different phi sub S of X's for each position, but we still have to decide where we're going to evaluate it for the molecule. So yeah, that is another underlying approximation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I think we can continue.
All right. So let's go ahead here. Where were we? There. Okay. So the last part is going to be on heterogeneous electrochemical PCET. And remember, heterogeneous electrochemical PCET means that the electrode is participating in the bond breaking and forming, as well as serving as a reservoir for the electrons. So the proton then will be transferred to or from the electrode surface in chemisorbed species. So this ends up being a little more complicated, but you'll see that in some sense, again, the same physical principles are still going to shine through. Now, the most basic heterogeneous electrochemical PCET reaction is proton discharge on electrode, the Volmer reaction, right? Very straightforward. You've got a metal site M star, you've got an acid AH plus, and the acid's giving its proton to the electrode, forming a metal hydrogen bond. So now the hydrogen is absorbed on the metal. Now there are many models of the Volmer reaction, right? I don't have time to go through the whole history. It's enormous. So the early models were based on adiabatic proton transfer, where the proton needs to overcome a barrier on the ground electronic state. And then there were early non-adiabatic models for the Volmer reaction, which were based on the non-adiabatic theory of electrochemical ET of Marcus, Levitch, and Daganatsa. And then these models were also extended by many others in different directions. So like I said, I don't have time to go through all of them, and they all have their advantages and disadvantages and so forth. What I will do is say what we were able to do in terms of just taking that theory that I've already been talking about, so it just keeps us in the same framework, and just applying it to a heterogeneous PCET reaction. So now our rate constant depends on the distance r from the electrode and the applied potential E. So we've actually eliminated one coordinate, right? Before we had R was the proton donor acceptor distance, and X was the distance of the molecule from the electrode. Now they're the same, right? Because the proton is being transferred to the electrode. So R, we just have R, there's no more X. So that in some sense makes life a little bit simpler maybe. And the expression looks very similar, right? We have the summation over the reactant and product vibronic states, those stacked parabolas. We've got the Boltzmann population of the reactant state. We've got the V mu nu squared. We've got the integration over the one electron states weighted by the Fermi distribution and the density of states. And we have the exponential of the free energy barrier. And the delta G looks pretty similar, right? It's basically the intrinsic free energy difference plus this difference between the proton vibrational energy levels. We've got the applied potential here. It's written slightly differently from before, different reference, but same idea. And we've got that electrostatic potential phi s that we get from some model of the electrical double layer. So it's all looking quite similar to what we've already seen. Now, to get the current density, we're going to thermally average over R now, weighting by the instead of the P of R, we are weighting by the concentration of the acid at that value of R. And that will get us the current density as a function of applied potential E. Now, one complication that comes in when you're doing heterogeneous PCET is because the proton's being transferred directly to the electrode, the electronic coupling is expected to be pretty large, right? Because it's right there, the molecule's on the electrode. And so the general form of the vibronic coupling, in some cases, needs to be used to span the electronically adiabatic and nonadiabatic regime. So this V mu nu, this kappa mu nu of delta over 2 that we actually look back at during the questions, that might be critical in some cases to be able to describe heterogeneous PCET, especially that product of the electronic coupling and the overlap that, again, the last question was on. Here's a place where you probably don't want to use that, or you might not be able to use that for certain heterogeneous PCET reactions. So that's where you got to be a little bit careful. So just looking at an example of PCET from triethyl ammonium acid to a gold surface in acetonitrile. This is rate limiting for the hydrogen evolution reaction, and experiments from Yogi Surendranath's group show a potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. So what's happening here is the proton is transferring from TeAH to gold, forming a gold hydrogen bond. So again, it's just a simple Volmer reaction, but it's occurring in acetonitrile, so it's a little bit different than some in the sense that the acid doesn't get quite as close as it would maybe in acidic water, for example. And what they measured is the log of the current density as a function of applied potential, and you can see that for TeAH plus versus TeAD plus, they have different Toffel slopes and different transfer coefficients. And that means that the kinetic isotope effect ranges from 1.5 to 6.3 over this range of applied potential. So that's what I mean by a potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. So we applied our theory to this, and we were able to reproduce the potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. So the different Toffel slopes and transfer coefficients, you can see here's our theory, here's their experiment. And the agreement's pretty good. But I do want to point out that we had some parameters that we could fit to experiment. For example, we could shift them along the X and Y axes to make them in the right place, sort of use the appropriate references. And we were able to tweak some parameters to get this level of agreement. But it's not so much the quantitative agreement that I want to emphasize, it's the qualitative agreement. As far as I know, no other model has been able to reproduce this kind of potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. And it's also the fact that we were able to obtain a physical explanation for why they're observing this potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. And that's because different pairs of the proton vibrational states are dominating for hydrogen and deuterium with different dependence on the applied potential. So we go back to this picture I showed before of the two reactant parabolas and the product parabola. And we had these, remember I talked about the fact that the contributions from these two pairs of states, 0, 0, and 1, 0, that depends on a balance among several factors. One of those factors was the Boltzmann population of the reactant state. So in this case, for deuterium, the splittings are going to be smaller between the energy levels. And that means that there's going to be more population of the excited reactant vibrational states for deuterium than for hydrogen. And that's what leads to these different potential dependencies. So it's easier to see that if we just plot the percent of contributions for TeH plus and TeD plus. For hydrogen, you can see 0, 0, and 1, 0 pairs are contributing all the way along. For deuterium, you see now the 2, 0 pair creeps in. So remember, that's the 2,0 is the second excited vibrational state of the reactant. And that's because the splittings are smaller, so deuterium can populate that. And so what we see, if we then plot the log of the current density as a function of applied potential for each one of these pairs separately, we can see that the 1,0 and the 0,0 have very similar slopes, but the 2,0 has a smaller slope as a function of applied potential. And that mixing in of the 2,0 for deuterium is what's leading to the lower transfer coefficient for deuterium versus hydrogen. So it's the smaller level splittings for deuterium that's leading to greater contributions from excited reactant vibrational states that then leads to this potential dependent kinetic isotope effect. So this is a case where treating the transferring proton quantum mechanically and including excited vibronic states is absolutely essential for describing the experimentally observed phenomenon. So I mentioned already that there are many different models for the Volmer reaction. So I want to then talk a little bit about adiabatic models, right? So in some cases, what I just, the example I just talked about in acetonitrile, right, that TEAH, because it's in acetonitrile, it's still kind of staying sort of a reasonable distance from the electrode. Now, if we start talking about water, right, and you've got acids in water and H3O+, that's going to get right up against the electrode surface. And you might expect the reaction to be adiabatic. In fact, it's often treated as adiabatic. And there is a vast literature on adiabatic models for the Volmer reaction. So extensions of Anderson-Newton's model Hamiltonians, you've got Grimminger, Schmickler, Koper, Santos, and those are only some names. I'm leaving out probably lots of very important people. And multi-state empirical valence bond, EVB methods with molecular dynamics. Greg Both and coworkers have studied this. So these are just some examples. And again, just to keep with the sort of same framework, I'll just talk about the general electronically adiabatic model we developed in our group using EVB theory and a quantum treatment of the proton and continuum solvent. So we described the system in terms of a basis that's shown right here, diabatic EVB electronic states. For the reactant, we have a covalent bond between the hydrogen and the proton donor. These dotted lines show that covalent bond. You just have one of those reactant states. For the product, we have a whole series, a continuum of product states corresponding to this hydrogen forming a covalent bond with an electron in the electrode. And we use these as a basis to create a Hamiltonian matrix. And then we derived an expression for the free energy surface as a function of the proton coordinate r, the distance capital R between the acid and the electrode, a collective solvent coordinate x, again, related to that collective solvent coordinate that goes way back to the Marcus theory for electron transfer on that early slide, and the applied potential E. So then we think about something like proton discharge in acidic aqueous solution. So you've got basically, it's the first step for the hydrogen evolution reaction and other important reactions. In acidic solution, typically the proton donor is H3O+, or some cluster that has an extra proton in it. And so the proton goes to the electrode, an electron comes from the electrode, and this is the PCET reaction shown right there. Now, PCET from water to a gold electrode in acidic solution is predominantly electronically adiabatic with a small degree of vibrational nonadiabaticity. So here's a case where you can probably get away with an adiabatic treatment for the most part. So what we did is we generated the adiabatic vibronic free energy surfaces, these U0s that depend again on the proton coordinate, the proton donor-acceptor distance, the collective solvent coordinate. And we do this for different applied potentials E. So here we have a surface as a function of the proton coordinate and the collective solvent coordinate. Now we have fixed capital R and E. Then we quantize the proton. All right, we solve this Schrodinger equation. These phi's are related to the phi's I showed in the proton potentials, but these are a little bit different, but same idea. We quantize the proton, and now we get these free energies as a function of a collective solvent coordinate X. These are now electron-proton vibronic states, just like what I was talking about before, only these are adiabatic electron-proton vibronic states. So if the reaction is purely adiabatic, what we would do is we'd say, let's do this for a whole series of different values of capital R, right, the proton donor acceptor distance, get a two-dimensional surface, move on the ground vibronic state and get a barrier and plug it into transition state theory, and you'd be done. You'd have your rate constant. But you can see that there's a little bit of a small splitting here between these two vibrational energy levels, suggesting that maybe vibrational nonadiabaticity might actually be sort of important in this case. And because of this small splitting, we considered the case that you need to include vibrational nonadiabaticity. So here, these dashed lines are the adiabatic vibronic states from the previous slide, and then we can diabatize them using because it's two states, you can actually do this exactly using the nonadiabatic coupling. I won't get into the details, but you have the blue state and the red state, these two diabatic states. And then we can use a curve crossing formulation to include vibrational nonadiabaticity and solvent dynamics. And this was inspired by analogous theories for ET and PT. We did not invent this kind of curve crossing. We just applied it to the case of PCET. So what you do is you say, let's let the rate constant be some prefactor, nu of R, times exponential of the effective activation free energy. And we're not going to worry about that. We're going to focus on this prefactor. And this prefactor can be expressed in terms of one over the Landau-Zener frequency factor and 1 over the solvent-controlled frequency factor. And so here, this comes to the Landau-Zener question that was asked earlier. I'm not going to get into the details of all this, but what I will say is that this unified formulation allows us to interpolate the prefactor between the three regimes. The regime we've been in most of this talk is the Fermi-Golden rule regime, where we have small vibronic coupling and fast vibrational or fast solvent relaxation. Okay, and that's when the prefactor would just be proportional to the square of the coupling. Now, if we have a large vibronic coupling and still very fast solvent dynamics, then we're in the transition state theory regime, where we can just get the barrier of the ground state and that's it, right? It doesn't even depend on the coupling here. And then we have the solvent controlled regime, which is when you have the longer relaxation time, so solvent is slower, right? In that case, the prefactor is proportional to 1 over the longitudinal relaxation time. And this formulation, this interpolation thing, is able to smoothly interpolate between these different regimes. And so we've got this H3O plus in water giving its proton to metal, and then we can calculate the rate constants using this. We can do this for different values of R. That's the distance of the redox molecule from the electrode, weighting it by the concentration of H3O plus, integrate over all R, and we get the current density. And then we can calculate transfer coefficients and kinetic isotope effects, and you can see we're getting values that are in a good agreement with experimental data from the literature. And adding this little bit of vibrational nonadiabaticity does lead to better agreement with experiments. But this is still predominantly adiabatic. And this kind of a curve crossing, two-state curve crossing thing is very specific to when you have only two states that you care about. And so it's not a general formulation that you can use all the time. It seems to work for H3O plus on gold, those sort of situations. But we also wanted to develop a more general vibronic model and diabatic representation. So we took those same two sets of electronic basis states, right? The one for the reactant where you've got a covalent bond between the proton and the proton donor, and then the set of continuum of product states between when you form a bond between the proton and an electrode state, these delocalized states. And because they're delocalized, they're very small electronic couplings for macroscopic electrode volumes. So now what we have is we do the same thing we did before, where we calculate for the reactant state, that's the blue parabola, we get all the proton vibrational states. You get a whole set of stacked parabolas. For the product states, we have a continuum of electronic states, and then all those proton vibrational states on top of them. So they're all kind of intertwined, right? They're intermingled there. And so we just have this big continuum, this sort of big mess of vibronic states. And we just look at the transitions between the reactant and product, diabatic vibronic states of a continuum of crossing points. And in this case, the reaction probability for a given crossing point is determined by the probability of reaching the crossing point, say this one here, and the probability of a transition at that point, but also the probability of bypassing the other crossing points. And this is very, very important to include, because what we want to do is we want to span the nonadiabatic and adiabatic regimes. So the coupling strength we get from the integrated weighted density of states over the entire electronic band of the electrode. So even though all the individual couplings are small enough to use a nonadiabatic treatment, a perturbative treatment, the overall coupling could in fact be adiabatic, and we smoothly interpolate between the nonadiabatic and adiabatic limits for the entire range of coupling strength with this approach. And so we applied it to proton discharge in alkaline solution, where now the proton donor is H2O instead of H3O plus. This H2O is going to behave kind of differently. That the model that we used is we have this water molecule, it's giving its proton to the surface, and we have another water molecule that gives its proton to the first water, and also its OH absorbs onto the gold surface. This is just a model. We don't know for sure that this is the correct model, but it allows us to generate the input quantities we need for our rate constant expression. And what we find is we can we can plot the kinetic isotope effect as a function of potential, and we get, you can see a pretty large kinetic isotope effect and also potential dependent. And that it's not completely clear. It could, these are very difficult experiments to do, and the calculations are very sensitive to some of the input parameters. But the concept is, so these exact numbers may not be, I would not say they're absolutely quantitatively correct, but qualitatively, the fact is that seeing a relatively large isotope effect and potential dependent seems to be valid for alkaline solution. And the physical basis when we analyze our rate constant expression is the different contributions from the excited vibronic states arise for hydrogen versus deuterium. So this is exactly the same origin as we had for the Volmer reaction of TEAH plus N-acetonitrile. So the same physics comes back in two very different systems. One's in water, one's in acetonitrile, and a different acid as well. So I just want to point out, so all of that we've talked about has really been focusing on rate constants, kinetic isotope effects. There are many other aspects of modeling electrochemical PCET. Thermodynamics, calculating proton-coupled redox potentials and Pourbaix diagrams. There's constant potential methods for electrochemical PCET, generating potential energy surfaces, activation energies, interfacial dynamics, how to describe the electrical double layer, doing better than a dielectric continuum model, say with simulations with explicit solvent and ions. Using vibrational probes to study interfacial electric fields. So that can be done both computationally and experimentally. Ran canonical formulations of electrochemical rate theories. This is, I think, an important direction. Microkinetic modeling of electrochemical PCET. I've been focusing on one PCET reaction, but this is in catalysis. It's one step of many. How do we combine them all and basically put them together and to really understand the full catalytic cycle? And simulating voltammograms as well. So a lot of this is reviewed in a review that just went online of chemical reviews and there's actually going to be entire chemical reviews thematic issue on computational electrochemistry that'll come out in a few months. This will be one of maybe 10 or more different review articles in this thematic issue. So I encourage you to take a look at that when it comes out. Remaining challenges and future directions, right? We need better methods to compute the input quantities to these PCET rate constant expressions. I told you some of the, and we've talked about some of the questions pointed out, well, you're making an approximation here or there, and that's true. So how can we do better? How can we describe the electrical double layer better? And the electrode surface. Often catalysis occurs at defect sites. If you use a perfect crystal to do your DFT calculation for your input quantities, you might be missing something important. How do we do direct molecular dynamics simulations, including a constant electrode potential? And how do you choose what functional to use? Certain functionals work for metals and other works well for molecules, but how do you choose which one to use if you have a molecule at an interface, at a metal interface? What about quantizing the protons? Most molecular dynamics simulations use classical protons. What about including non-adiabatic effects? Most just move on the ground state. Well, we can do non-adiabatic dynamics with Ehrenfest or surface hopping. We can quantize the protons, even in periodic DFT, using either path integral methods or a nuclear electronic orbital, NEO method that my group's been developing, and we've actually applied now to water at a TiO2 surface. Machine learning is a big new emerging area in this field, and it could help in many ways. For example, facilitating the design of electrocatalysts or better ways to compute the input quantities, and coupling this electrochemical PCET to the other catalytic steps in kinetic modeling. So all of this remains for us to work on, so at least we won't be bored. We'll have jobs and lots to do. So the take-home messages are that the standard ground state treatment of electrochemical PCET is not always sufficient. Just calculating the transition state for the ground state may not be the way to go. Treating the transferring hydrogen nucleus quantum mechanically, including excited electron-proton vibronic states, are essential for describing at least some experimental data. Not all. There may be cases where you don't need this. And electrochemical PCET can span adiabatic and non-adiabatic regimes, so you need to use the appropriate rate constant for the regime you're in, or use a general rate constant that spans all of the regimes. And as I mentioned, there are many challenges that remain, especially for computing input quantities accurately and simulating the explicit dynamics. And so then I want to just sort of acknowledge a lot of the people in my group who have worked on these problems over the many years, the places that have funded it, and again, point you to this ChemRev article if you're interested in learning more about some of these aspects. And I'd be happy to take more questions now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sharon. We're open for further questions. Maybe I can start. If you can go to this slide where you showed the diagram that you calculate the final diagram between, I think it's maybe 10 slides or so back. Yeah, this one. So
Which one?
This one.
Here?
So when you have a solvent relaxation time and vibronic coupling. So my understanding is that whenever you do calculation, you still have to really calculate the structures, right? So you have to do DFT and molecular dynamics and so on. How do these parameters really depend on your input parameters, on the type of approximation that you use? Because there are so many input parameters in the DFT. Is it that sensitive? So, or how do we know really which ones to use if it's so sensitive?
Yeah, I mean, so usually for the input parameters to the PCET theory, we're not really doing molecular dynamics. We're usually like for the heterogeneous one, we would do periodic DFT to get the input parameters. Or you sometimes we'll use dielectric continuum models. I mean, clearly your rate constant's only as good as what you put in, right? So if the input parameters are not reliable and they're not experimentally, relevant, then of course your rate constant is not likely to be. But I don't know that, I don't think you need to have absolutely quantitatively accurate numbers to get a qualitative picture of what's going on. So I think in many cases, if you're asking a conceptual question, why does this trend happen? Or for the example, why do you see a potential dependent kinetic isotope effect? We were able to see that without necessarily having perfect input quantities. So I think it really depends on the question you're asking. If you want to get, rate constant, the magnitude of a rate constant, even, to within an order of magnitude, I think would be tough with this theory because you don't get all the parameters, well enough to really be able to do that would be hard. If you want to say, I have two molecules, which one do I think is going to be faster? Then you might be able to do that by calculating the relative rate constant. So what's the kinetic isotope effect going to be? So in that case, some of the errors may cancel out. So I think you have to be careful what question you're asking, and you can't expect too much from a theory that does have underlying approximations. And I'm not trying to shove them under the rug, right? They're definitely there. And so I think you just have to proceed with caution and ask your questions in a way that where the theory can provide some insights.
This is a very good point. Thank you. I think we have a question from Andrzej.
Right, I think he has to unmute himself.
Okay, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, now I do.
Yes, I'm simply experimentalist and I'm amazed with your calculations, but when I look at the data you were using data for hydrogen evolution at gold electrode, if I understand. And of course, during hydrogen evolution, there are two reactions, Volmer and Heroski. It might be tougher. Also, it means that the rates of both reactions are the same. And on gold, there is a very, very weak adsorption of hydrogen on the metal surface. There are other metals like palladium, platinum, rhodium, ruthenium, and so on. When there is a so-called hydrogen UPD or strong adsorption of hydrogen, I don't think that using gold is the best choice for such calculations, comparison.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely right. We're only looking at the Volmer step. We're not looking at the following steps. So in some sense, we're assuming that that it's rate limiting, or at least that the kinetic isotope effect is dominated by that step, right? That the other ones, wouldn't have that. So that is underlying. I mean, I think in acetonitrile, it might be different than you're probably thinking about in water. So you're absolutely right. There are different surfaces. We have looked a little bit at silver and platinum. So I think we can certainly, it's a point well taken that we have to be sure that the step we're looking at is the step that they're actually measuring experimentally. So yeah, we are open to looking at other surfaces.
Or UPD reaction when there is only Volmer.
Yes, absolutely. We're actually looking at one of that as right now. In fact, that's current work. You're absolutely right. When you can really isolate it. So, and it's much cleaner. So I agree, and we are on it. So hopefully, there will be something from that in the next few months.
Thank you.
James?
Hello. If you look at the potential dependent KIE data and you extrapolate towards lower potential, it appears that the curves should overlap and you would get a primary kinetic isotope effect less than 1. Are those conditions experimental? Are those accessible? Have people done that kind of experiment? And what do they see?
Yeah, for this particular system, I don't think it was accessible, right? Because at some point, right, you get a certain potential range, and I guess your system starts to degrade, and other things happen, right? It's just not experimentally accessible. So for a Yogi system, I don't believe they could go wider. I think they went as wide as they could, presumably. But there are cases where you could see inverse kinetic isotope effects for various reasons. That's not unheard of. So it's possible, and with the PCET theory, we can get that with certain sets of parameters. I think it's relatively rare, and sometimes it also means that something else is rate limiting that might not be fully just the PCET reaction. So so the answer is for the systems that I showed, I don't think that we have a case like that experimentally, but the theory certainly can lead to inverse kinetic isotope effects, and so it could be. I think it could definitely be. It's possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
Under the right conditions, right? I think that PCET, right, it is it's sort of a very rich field in the sense that there's a lot of, because you see many different factors that are all balancing each other and contributing, so you can get different combinations that can lead to different types of behavior.
Renat, you wanted to ask a question?
Okay, I have a short question. In your talk, you mentioned one important and interesting regime when proton-coupled electron transfer proceeds under the solvent control. So we can say that in this case, solvent dynamics effect can play a crucial role. So my question is, do you know some experimental data which corresponds just to this regime, and did you try to model such reactions?
Yeah, we found for the ones we were studying, the solvent controlled had a very small contribution, but it did contribute a little bit. Whether it's when it's sort of a dominant contribution, I think in the electron transfer field, you just have to find a solvent, I guess, with a very slow relaxation time scale. And I think that has been seen, but we haven't done it for PCET. So, but it is an interesting regime to explore even with PCET, right? I think the way you'd want to do it is choose different types of solvents, right? Like I said, it did play a small role here, but not as big a role. It depends on also the distance of the H3O plus from the electrode is when certain regimes became more or less dominant. So, but it's an interesting regime to explore, and we can at least interpolate between it with this unified formulation, which again had been done for electron transfer by others. This sort of a unification.
May I just add a word there?
Yeah, great, Rudy, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was in the 1990s, there were a series of studies of very fast electron transfer reactions in Israel. And the rate of the reaction was essentially related to the one of the dielectric, the slowest dielectric relaxation time. There was a series of about 5 or 10 such reactions. So that actually produced a large renewal of interest in the theoretical community on the effect of the solvent dynamics. So there are electron transfer reactions where the rate of reaction is not determined by activation parameters, though it's intrinsically very fast, but by the solvent dynamic relaxation time.
Yeah, thank you, Rudy. Yeah, so that is, I mean, it definitely exists in the literature. So thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is an interesting regime. And I assume that if it's going to happen for electron transfer, it could happen for PCET as well, right? There's no reason why not.
Please, Simon.
Yes. I had a question, Sharon. In the end, you mentioned the electronic coupling on surfaces and just the surface states and the weighted density of states. And I was just wondering, I guess I'll read your review, but has anyone calculated this weighted density of states? Because that's the DOS and the electronic couplings for a continuum.
Right. Yes, we have this paper here. You might want to take a look at where we did calculate the weighted density of states, and it also has the overlap in there as well.
Nice. So just a follow up: is that in a periodic simulation, or is that like a cluster kind of non-periodic approach?
Oh, that was not. So yeah, that was not done in actual DFT calculation. It was done more formally, I'd say.
Okay. Okay.
So it was more for a model system.
Yeah. Would you say that that's WDOS is kind of something of interest? If I could calculate it?
I think so. I would be interested. Certainly my group would be interested.
Okay.
Yeah. If there are ways to calculate it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a key, it's the key parameter in some sense in determining the coupling strength in these kinds of, in this formulation. I didn't go into detail in this formulation. Well, I know we're already at 2 hours and probably most people are ready for whatever time zone they're in, whatever comes next. But yeah, there's a lot more that could be said about this, and I do think it's a very interesting problem. It's just fairly complex, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could do it, I think there would be a lot of interest, certainly from my group, and I'm sure others as well.
You're the first one that I saw call it the WDOS. It's got lots of names. I mean, Schmickler calls it the chem-absorption function. It's in the Nunes-Anderson theory as well. So yeah, does the WDOS, did you give it that name, or is that from somewhere else that I don't know?
I mean, it's in our paper. I don't know if it's been,
Okay.
if it's been used elsewhere.
I'll check it out. Thanks a lot. It's just giving me some motivation here.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure the paper cites the, whoever,
Yeah.
if the authors have done it, yeah, it should be cited in that paper.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I guess maybe I can, ask the last question and then we will finish with this. Getting back to the Volmer reaction, I'm curious, it looks like, indeed the theory really well aligns with the experiments in terms of the kinetic isotope effect. But at the same time, this is a really inner sphere reaction where the Poisson-Boltzmann equation probably doesn't work so well. I mean, it shouldn't. So how, Sharon, how would you explain that it really is so well describing the experiment?
So I'm sorry, which equation do you say won't work?
Yeah, so if you go to the Volmer reaction, that's maybe.
Not sure which one, but the basic
description of, yeah, something like that. So no, that's okay. You can go back where you had theory and experiments at the same time.
Like that? Yes.
So there is a pretty good correlation, right? So I'm curious, since I understand it that you used a Poisson-Boltzmann equation for the calculation of the rate, so you had to include the double layer in that way.
Oh, right. How we included the double layer effect.
So my question is, since, I mean, we've been talking a lot at this colloquium about the double layer effect, and we will have a lot more in the future. How can you explain that the theory and experiments work so well for this system, which has a very complex double layer from the theory point of view? It's hard to use continuum models for this metal hydrogen system.
Right. I mean, one thing that might have helped us here is this is acetonitrile, not water. And I think dielectric continuum would tend to work better in acetonitrile. So I'm guessing that was a big help in these calculations. So we used, and for these calculations, we use this very simple, I don't know where it is. That we use this very simple model of the double layer for that particular calculation, and it's very simplistic. So you're absolutely right; it's missing a lot of the structure. But I think we found that the overall results that I was showing on that other slide are not strongly dependent on the details of that phi s of x. And I think again, it's in acetonitrile, it may be less important. but it was, we actually tried different types of double layer effects. I think we even, if I remember correctly, we even tried to remove it altogether, and it didn't, qualitatively, we could still get this kind of potential dependent kinetic isotope with or without that phi s of x. So it's not sensitive to that. It's much more sensitive to the vibrational energy level. So the isotope effect, in some sense, you could say, well, hydrogen and deuterium, whatever errors we're making with phi s are probably canceling out, right? For hydrogen and deuterium, they're going to be the same errors. And what's really important here in getting this this behavior is including these excited vibronic states and summing them up in the right way with the right essential physics. So I think that's really dominating this kinetic isotope effect. And I also mentioned at the time we had some free parameters in this particular calculation. We don't always, but in this particular one we did. And so we were able to fit to experiment. And so that also probably effectively took care of some of the double layer effects that are probably existing in the experiments, that they effectively are embedded in the parameters that we fit to experiment. You know, our goal here was, can we explain qualitatively why you get this, you know, potential dependent kinetic isotope effect? So in that sense, I think we were able to get the qualitative insight, but I think that the quantitative, you know, numbers, I agree, will be sensitive to all of these different aspects, including the electrical double layer. And it will become more important for like H3O plus, right, on the gold, because that's going to be closer, and that's going to be, you know, it's going to be a bigger effect in that case. For much of the homogeneous electrochemical PCET, it's in the at the outer Helmholtz layer anyway, so it's actually not going to be that important. It's heterogeneous when it becomes more important, because the molecule gets closer to the surface, and that's of course where we need to worry. So acetonitrile might help us a little bit here. When we start getting down to the, you know, water, H3O plus, then of course it's going to become more important. But again, having some parameters that can effectively account for this, you know, probably lets us get at least in the ballpark, at least qualitatively describing it. And that's what I meant at the end, where there's certainly room for improvement in terms of how we get the input quantities.
Right. So yeah, thank you so much. I mean, these details are really important, I think. Okay, then with this, probably we're coming to an end. So Sharon, thank you so much for this really excellent and thorough talk. And I really like this tutorial approach that you took here. So I guess a lot of students will really appreciate, because it basically describes step by step how to do this.
Well, hopefully it was useful. It's not, there's a lot of pieces of it to put together, and it's I know it's not that understandable, and 2 hours is a long time to concentrate.
Well, one can at least evaluate the major steps.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for your good questions as well, which also makes me think. So I enjoy that as well.
Thank you.